to 60 years after the cross. And some people are going to say that's far too far to make a difference in history. I'd say study ancient history. The earliest biography we have of Alexander is about 400 years after his death. Our main accounts for Julius Caesar are about a century and a half after his death. The Gospels at 40 to 60 are looking pretty good. You might say, well, yeah, but that's religious propaganda. Please ask a question during the Q&A. Be glad to talk to you. Come back to Paul. Paul writes 1 Corinthians 15, conservative, liberal, virtually no difference, 55 AD. It's only 20 years after the cross. But most critics, I'm going to give you their conclusion. I'm going to cut right to this. Most critics believe that Paul received this material in Jerusalem from the apostles and eyewitnesses, Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Peter denies his Lord. James is an unbeliever. Almost all New Testament scholars believe, until he meets the risen Jesus. He meets them. They discuss the gospel. And Paul learns what they're believing. Of course, Paul was a recipient of an appearance much earlier. Now, this is only 5 years after the event. Now, he might say, well, look, 5 years is not 2 weeks, and 2 weeks even, we even have a lot of errors after 2 weeks for early eyewitnesses. We do. But there's a reason it's the best evidence we produce today, generally, in courts of law. It's empirical evidence by the secondary historical standard. All right, so Paul gets this at +5 from them. But if Paul received this material just 5 years after the cross, they had it before he did. And that's earlier. When do critics date this? Critics believe that this material comes from 30 AD, or whatever year you want to pick for the death of Jesus. It comes from that year. How do you know this? This is surely very conservative, right? No. First of all, the material is formalized into a creed. It takes a while to pass things on like that. Garrett Ludeman, an atheist New Testament scholar, says the latest this formalization of the data could be is 3 years after the cross. The Jesus Seminar in America, who reject 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus in those translations of the Bible with the red letters, they say it's 2 years after the cross. And just recently, 3 major British scholars, Larry Hurtado, Edinburgh University, Richard Bauckham, he was here today, and he lives in Cambridge, but showed up today for a lecture at Tyndale House. He's a great example, just retired from St. Andrews University. James D.G. Dunn is influential as anybody in recent historical Jesus scholarship. And these 3 put the report at 30 AD. Now, you can say whatever you want to about comparing this to 2008, but I'm going to tell you something. This makes a grade that is unbelievable in the ancient world. There's nothing like it. In fact, liberal German historian Hans von Kampenhausen said, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following meets all the prerequisites that we could possibly have of an ancient text. Now, that's way back in the 60s he made that comment. But just recently, a book published by your own Cambridge University Press, What Can We Know About Jesus, by Howard Clark Key, an American theologian who, the only time I've met him, he was arguing for the agnostic position in the New Testament. This is an agnostic position. He begins his book by saying the data for the resurrection of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 9:1 and 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, where a list of Jesus' appearances is produced. Howard Clark Key begins his book by saying this could be tested in a normal court of law. He said, so good is this evidence that we could put it on trial today and get a positive verdict. Cambridge University Press, What Can We Know About Jesus? I'll bring this to a close. I don't think that the 3 arguments on this sheet are going to help us to rule out the resurrection. Now, what will they help us to do? These philosophical concerns of Dr. Ahmed's are good. They are, because they help us caution evidence, but they cannot rule evidence out. And different things change evidence. If there's a God, the whole system changes. If near-death experience is obtained, the whole system changes. I'm saying we have here good data arrived at by scholars who do not believe in a resurrection, yet they say the data are good. And by the way, the trend today is for bodily resurrection. So I'd submit to you empirically that what we have is a case that says if we're open, and events like this are possible, if life after death obtains, then we have to be open to ancient accounts that scholars put this kind of credit in that we can test it in a court of law.
I thank both speakers very much for their speeches. And now we move into a period of informal discussion between the two. So whoever would like to kick us off, feel free.
Thank you. Perhaps I could start then. There were a number of things in your talk that I wanted to pick up on. Perhaps very briefly we could start with the first point, because it would be very helpful. You said that you didn't have an issue with various events, such as the 7-day creation, the parting of the Red Sea, and so on. Could you just please confirm, it would be very simple, you could do it in 2 seconds, that you think those things either didn't happen or it is doubtful that they happened?
Yes. You were telling me, yes, that's fine.
They didn't happen. Okay, thank you.
Or undoubtful, yes.
Well, okay, thank you. Perhaps I could move on now to the next point, which is one that you brought up a number of times, which was that if eyewitness testimony is so bad as that, why do we use it in courts of law?
Yeah, and I don't mean it's so bad. I just mean, can we find exceptions? Of course we can find exceptions, but does that invalidate eyewitness testimony? Not for a second.
It doesn't invalidate eyewitness testimony. The point is not that eyewitness testimony is really bad or invalidated. The point is that given the evidence we have, eyewitness testimony getting it wrong is more likely than solid bodies passing through rock.
Oh, okay. So you're saying, let me make sure I understand this. You're saying we have more chance to accept an eyewitness, what, someone says it passes through rock, and you say chances are you're wrong?
Yes.
Okay. Now, this is not on God's existence, but would you allow that if there's a God, that can happen? If there's near-death experiences, there could be an afterlife. Any of this sort of thing changes data. For example, I don't want this to go anywhere, but to answer, we're not going to a theistic debate, but to answer your question, would you say if God existed, God could potentially take a body through rock? Is that possible? If a traditional theistic God existed, is that possible on theism?
It's not a question of what's possible or not, it's a question of what's likely or not. Of course, it's logically possible in any case, whether or not God exists, that solid bodies should pass through rock. No contradiction is involved in it.
But if God created the world, taking a body through rock doesn't really seem like an issue, does it?
If God doesn't exist, it's supremely unlikely. If God does exist and can do whatever he likes, I've got no way of judging what's more likely than what.
Fair, but if that God judges evidence, if that God also says eyewitness testimony, if we can argue from the principles of Scripture that eyewitness testimony is good, early testimony is good, if God says things that indicate, let's just say, that certain scientific laws obtain, that there even are laws of nature. In other words, if God is an evidence-granting God, an evidence, a God who recognizes evidence and who sets disciples up, who many authors in the New Testament say, I've checked these guys out, I've checked data out. If God is such who tells us, hey, he gives us these senses, he tells us to go after this data, it certainly changes things if there's a God. What do you say about the near-death experiences? If there's an afterlife, would you be more open? Or the question I ask you, what would it take for you to say, wow, resurrection is looking better and better right here?
Okay, there's 3 questions there. The first question, as far as I understand it, seems to be, would I believe that solid bodies could pass through rock if God told me that they did? And the answer is no. The second...
No, I'm asking about near-death. Like something, I'm saying, what would have to obtain for you to say, I'm really open to a resurrection? I'm saying, for example, if there were some highly evidential near-death experiences, and if we talked and you came over and we watched a rugby match together, and at the end of the match you're going, yeah, this is pretty interesting about near-death experiences. I've never heard any evidence like this. I'm saying, would you then be more open to a resurrection?
Okay, good. I think there's 2 points I'd like to make about near-death experiences. The first point, for those of you who don't know, what Gary's referring to by near-death experiences is cases where somebody, for instance, is being operated upon, or somebody has an accident and their brain stops and their heart stops, and then afterwards they report, for instance, having been out of their body, or they report having seen lights and other sorts of phenomena that we normally associate with consciousness. Now, there's 2 things I'd like to say about that. The first thing is that even if there were near-death experiences, that seems to me entirely irrelevant to the question of bodily resurrection. That's like confusing the statement that if a ship is wrecked, then the sailor survives, with the statement that if the ship is wrecked, then the ship survives. Even if there are near-death experiences, it has no bearing whatever on the reanimation of a corpse after 3 days, let alone on the question of whether solid bodies can pass through rock. The second thing I'd like to say, and I was hoping not to have to cite any other scholarly authorities, but it seems that I do. In summer 2007, the one journal which is peer-reviewed and which covers this issue, which is the journal